My engagement party was supposed to be the happiest night of my life, but instead it became the moment when everything I thought I knew about myself crumbled like sand through my fingers. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and what happened that evening would change not just my future, but reveal a past that had been buried so deep, even I didn't know it existed. The chandelier cast dancing shadows across the ballroom as I stood there in my champagne-colored dress, watching friends and family celebrate what should have been my perfect moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My fiancé Marcus had his arm wrapped around my waist, his smile bright as he chatted with his college buddies about our upcoming honeymoon plans. Everything looked picture perfect from the outside, but there was a storm brewing that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I had spent months planning this engagement party, carefully selecting every detail from the ivory roses to the string quartet playing softly in the corner. The venue was elegant but not ostentatious, exactly the kind of understated sophistication that would impress Marcus's family while still feeling warm and welcoming. At least, that's what I had hoped. My father, Robert Mitchell, stood across the room near the bar, his shoulders rigid beneath his expensive suit. He had been acting strange all evening, avoiding eye contact and responding to congratulations with tight-lipped nods, instead of his usual boisterous laughter. Dad had always been my biggest supporter, the one who cheered the loudest at my college graduation, who walked me through every major decision in my 26 years of life. But tonight, something was different. Mom, Linda, fluttered around the room like a nervous butterfly, her hands constantly smoothing her dress or adjusting her pearl necklace. Every few minutes, she would glance over at Dad with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was the look she got when she was keeping a secret, the same expression she'd worn when they were planning my surprise 16th birthday party. But this felt heavier, darker somehow. Marcus squeezed my hand, pulling me back to the present moment. "You okay, babe? You seem a million miles away." His green eyes searched my face with the kind of concern that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. Marcus was steady, reliable, everything my chaotic childhood had taught me to value. He came from old money, the kind of family that had been in Chicago society for generations, and sometimes I still couldn't believe he had chosen me. "Just taking it all in," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's surreal, you know. All these people here for us." He pressed a gentle kiss to my temple. "They're here for you, Sarah. Everyone loves you." But even as he said it, I caught another glimpse of my father's tense expression, and doubt crept in like fog rolling over Lake Michigan. The evening had started beautifully. Guests had mingled on the terrace overlooking the city skyline, champagne glasses clinking as toasts were made to our future together. Marcus's parents, William and Catherine Brennan, had been gracious hosts, despite the fact that this party was technically being thrown by my family. They moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of people accustomed to social gatherings, and I had felt a warm sense of belonging as Catherine introduced me to family friends as our future daughter-in-law. My own extended family had been equally welcoming to Marcus, though I could sense the slight intimidation factor. The Brennans' wealth was generational, built on real estate investments and pharmaceutical patents that stretched back to the 1920s. My family, while comfortable, came from more modest beginnings. Dad had built his accounting firm from nothing, working 16-hour days throughout my childhood to provide the kind of life he'd never had growing up. But it was precisely because I knew my father so well that his behavior tonight was setting off alarm bells in my mind. Robert Mitchell was not a man who kept his emotions hidden. When he was proud, everyone knew it. When he was angry, the whole house shook. When he was worried, he paced and muttered and drove my mother crazy with his restless energy. Tonight, though, he was doing something I'd never seen before. He was withdrawing, pulling into himself like a turtle retreating into its shell. I excused myself from Marcus and made my way across the room, weaving between clusters of guests exchanging pleasantries and sharing old stories. The familiar faces of my childhood neighbors, mixed with Marcus's sophisticated friends, creating an interesting tapestry of my two worlds coming together. Mrs. Chen from next door was deep in conversation with one of Marcus's law firm partners about her famous chocolate chip cookies, while my college roommate Emma was charming Marcus's grandmother with stories from our study abroad trip to Italy. "Dad, I said softly, approaching him at the bar where he stood nursing what looked like his third scotch of the evening. You've been awfully quiet tonight. Everything okay? He looked up at me, and for just a moment his mask slipped. I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach clench with worry. It was fear, but also something else. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But then he forced that familiar smile back into place, the one that had reassured me through countless childhood scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. Just overwhelmed by how grown-up my little girl has become, he said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. Seems like yesterday you were in pigtails, demanding I read you one more bedtime story. I studied his face, noting the way his jaw was clenched and how he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Dad, what's going on? You've been acting weird all week, and tonight you're practically a ghost at my own engagement party. He took another sip of his scotch, and I could see his hand trembling slightly. Robert Mitchell's hands never shook. This was a man who could perform complex tax calculations without breaking a sweat, who had coached my softball team with unwavering confidence, who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with determination and hard work. Sarah, sweetheart, sometimes there are things that are better left in the past, he said finally, his words careful and measured. Tonight is about your future with Marcus. That's all that matters now. Before I could press him further, Mom appeared at my elbow, her smile bright but strained. Sarah, honey, Mrs. Brennan is looking for you. She wants to introduce you to Marcus's great-aunt Victoria, who just arrived from Boston. I glanced between my parents, sensing an unspoken communication passing between them. This was definitely not the time or place to dig deeper, but I made a mental note to corner Dad tomorrow, when we could talk privately. Whatever was bothering him, it was serious enough to cast a shadow over what should have been one of the happiest days of our family's life. The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, congratulations, and posed photographs. Marcus and I cut the engagement cake while cameras flashed, and I smiled until my cheeks ached. But underneath the surface joy, that nagging worry about my father's behavior continued to gnaw at me. It was during the speeches that things began to unravel in earnest. William Brennan had just finished a lovely toast about welcoming me into their family when Dad reluctantly took the microphone. Public speaking had never been his favorite activity, but he had always managed to rise to the occasion for important family moments. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the assembled guests with an expression that seemed almost panicked. Mom was watching him intently from her seat at the head table, and I could see her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. When Sarah was little, Dad began, his voice slightly hoarse. She used to ask me to tell her stories about where she came from. I would make up elaborate tales about princesses and magical kingdoms, anything to see that smile light up her face. The room was quiet, waiting for him to continue, but he seemed to have lost his train of thought. I felt a flutter of embarrassment mixed with concern as the silence stretched on. Dad, I called softly from my seat, trying to encourage him. He looked directly at me then, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. It was the look of a man who was drowning, who had been keeping his head above water for so long that his strength was finally giving out. The thing about stories, he continued, his voice gaining strength, but taking on an edge that made me uncomfortable, is that sometimes they're easier to tell than the truth. Sometimes the truth is too complicated, too painful, too dangerous to share. Marcus reached over and took my hand under the table, clearly sensing my distress. Conversations around the room had died down as guests picked up on the strange tension radiating from my father. But maybe, Dad said, his eyes never leaving mine, maybe some truths are too important to keep buried forever. That's when I saw him, a man I didn't recognize, standing in the doorway of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a marble column. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive but not flashy. His hair was graying at the temples, and he had the kind of observant eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. What struck me most was the way he was looking at my father, not with the polite interest of a wedding guest, but with the focused attention of someone conducting surveillance. Dad noticed my distracted gaze and followed it across the room. When he spotted the stranger, his face went completely white. The microphone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. "I need some air," he mumbled, practically fleeing from the makeshift stage and heading toward the terrace doors. The room erupted in confused murmurs as guests tried to make sense of what had just happened. Marcus was on his feet immediately, his protective instincts kicking in as he moved to follow my father. But I was frozen in place, staring at the mysterious man who had somehow triggered such a dramatic reaction. Mom was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared after Dad with an expression of pure devastation. This wasn't embarrassment or confusion. This was the look of someone whose worst nightmare was finally coming true. "Mom," I said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Who is that man? What's going on?" She looked at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing me for the first time, as if she was trying to memorize my face before everything changed forever. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, we tried so hard to protect you from this." Before I could ask what she meant, Catherine Brennan appeared beside our table, her social instincts taking over as she tried to manage the situation. "Perhaps we should give Robert a moment to collect himself," she suggested diplomatically. These kinds of events can be overwhelming, but I barely heard her. My attention was fixed on the stranger, who had now moved away from the column and was walking purposefully across the ballroom toward our table. He moved with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to taking charge of situations, and there was something about his bearing that screamed law enforcement. As he approached, I could see that his dark eyes were kind but serious, and there was a gravity to his expression that made my heart start racing. This wasn't a lost wedding guest or a party crasher. This was someone with a job to do, and that job involved my family. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, addressing my mother with a slight nod. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I think it's time." Mom closed her eyes as if she could make this all disappear, but when she opened them again she just nodded. "Detective Morrison, this is my daughter Sarah." Detective. The word hit me like a physical blow. Why was there a detective at my engagement party? What possible reason could law enforcement have for being interested in my family? "Miss Mitchell," Detective Morrison said, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "I know this is difficult timing, but there are some things you need to know about your family history. Things that have been kept from you for your own protection, but that can't stay hidden any longer." I stared at his outstretched hand, as if it were a snake, afraid that shaking it would somehow make this nightmare real. Around us, the party was grinding to a halt as guests sensed the drama unfolding, and began to edge closer, curiosity overcoming politeness. "I don't understand," I said, my voice sounding small and far away. "Protection from what? What family history?" Detective Morrison glanced around at the crowd of onlookers, and then back at me. "Perhaps we could find somewhere more private to talk." But before anyone could move, my father's voice cut through the room like a blade. He had returned from the terrace, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. "No," he said firmly, striding back toward us with determined steps. "If this is happening, it's happening here, in front of everyone. I won't let you destroy my daughter's life in secret." The detective regarded him calmly. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but Sarah has a right to know the truth about who she is and where she comes from. The statute of limitations may have run out on some things, but there are still ongoing investigations that require her cooperation." "Investigations into what?" I demanded, finding my voice at last. "What could possibly involve me? I'm a graphic designer, for God's sake. I design wedding invitations and corporate logos. What could law enforcement possibly want with me?" Detective Morrison looked at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and resolute. "Miss Mitchell, the truth is that you're not Sarah Mitchell. You never were." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt Marcus's hand tighten on mine, as if he could anchor me to reality through sheer force of will. Around us, the ballroom had gone completely silent, except for the soft classical music still playing from the string quartet, creating a surreal soundtrack to the destruction of my entire identity. "That's impossible," I whispered. "These are my parents. This is my life. I have baby pictures, birth certificates, school records, all expertly forged," Detective Morrison said gently. "Your real name is Elena Vasquez, and you disappeared from your home in Los Angeles 23 years ago, when you were 3 years old." The room began to spin around me, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "Disappeared. Kidnapped." The words echoed in my mind like a death knell, destroying everything I thought I knew about myself. I looked at my parents, searching their faces for denial, for anger at these ridiculous accusations. Instead, I saw confirmation written in every line of their features. Mom was sobbing openly now, while Dad stood with his shoulders slumped in defeat. "How long have you known?" I asked them, my voice barely audible. Dad cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his words came out cracked and broken. "We always knew, Sarah. From the very beginning, we knew." The confession hit me like a tidal wave, washing away 26 years of love and trust, and leaving me drowning in betrayal. My parents, the people who had raised me and cherished me and shaped me into who I was, had been living a lie my entire life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Every bedtime story, every proud moment, every family tradition had been built on the foundation of a crime. "We never meant to hurt anyone," Mom said through her tears. We wanted a child so desperately, and when the opportunity came, we convinced ourselves it was meant to be." Detective Morrison was watching this family implosion with professional detachment, but I could see compassion in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I need to remind you that anything you say can be used against you in court. You might want to contact an attorney before we continue this conversation." But Dad shook his head. "No, I'm tired of running from this. Sarah deserves to know everything, even if it destroys us." Marcus, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, suddenly stood up. "Wait just a minute," he said, his lawyer instincts finally kicking in. "You're telling us that Sarah was kidnapped as a child, that my fiancé is actually someone else entirely." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Detective Morrison replied. "Elena Vasquez was taken from her home in East Los Angeles on March 15, 2001. Her biological parents, Miguel and Rosa Vasquez, have never stopped looking for her. They've aged 2 decades waiting to know what happened to their little girl." I felt like I was watching this conversation happen to someone else, as if I had stepped outside my own body and was observing this bizarre scene from a distance. The woman in the champagne dress being told her entire life was a lie couldn't possibly be me. This had to be some kind of mistake, a case of mistaken identity that would be cleared up once cooler heads prevailed. But the look in my father's eyes told me otherwise. This was Robert Mitchell, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework and walked me to school every day until I was old enough to go alone. This was the man who had never lied to me about anything, who had always been brutally honest even when the truth was uncomfortable. And he was telling me, without words but with absolute clarity, that every single day of my life had been built on the biggest lie imaginable. "How?" I asked, the word coming out as barely a whisper. "How did this happen?" Mom looked at Dad, and some silent communication passed between them. Finally she took a shaky breath and began to speak. "We had been trying to have children for 8 years, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We had been through fertility treatments, adoption agencies, every option you can imagine. We had just been turned down by our 3rd adoption agency because of Dad's age when we got a call from someone we had worked with before." She paused, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Detective Morrison was taking notes, his pen moving steadily across a small notebook. "This person told us about a situation," Mom continued, "a child who needed a home, whose biological family couldn't take care of her anymore. We were told that all the legal paperwork had been handled, that we just needed to come and pick up our daughter." "And you believed that?" Marcus asked incredulously. "You didn't think it was suspicious that a 3-year-old child was just available with no questions asked?" Dad finally spoke up. "We wanted to believe it so badly that we didn't ask the questions we should have asked. When we saw you, Sarah, you were so small and scared, but you looked at us with these big brown eyes and reached for Linda immediately. It felt like destiny." "Where was I asked. "When you picked me up, where was I?" "A hotel room in Phoenix," Dad said quietly. "You were with a woman who said she was a social worker, but looking back, I realize we never saw any identification or official paperwork. She handed you over, we gave her $5,000 in cash for processing fees, and we drove straight home to Chicago." The casual way he mentioned the money made my stomach lurch. They had bought me like a piece of furniture, no questions asked. The transaction had been so simple, so clean, that they had managed to convince themselves it was legitimate. "What about my birth certificate?" I asked. "My social security number. All forged," Detective Morrison said. "Very professionally done, which is why it took us so long to trace the connections. The person who arranged your adoption was part of a larger network that specialized in providing false documentation for illegal adoptions." I thought about all the times I had used those documents, never questioning their authenticity. My driver's license, my passport for our trip to Italy, my college applications. Every official form I had ever filled out had been based on a lie so fundamental that it made me question whether I even existed. "The Vasquez family," I said slowly, testing the unfamiliar name on my tongue. "What are they like?" Detective Morrison's expression softened slightly. "They're good people, Elena. Your father Miguel works in construction, and your mother Rosa is a teacher's aide. You have 2 younger brothers, David and Carlos, who were born after you disappeared. They've kept your bedroom exactly the way it was, hoping that someday you would come home." The image he painted hit me like a physical blow. Somewhere in Los Angeles, there was a family that had been incomplete for 23 years because of what my parents had done. There were 2 boys who had grown up knowing they had a sister they had never met. Parents who had gone to bed every night wondering if their oldest child was safe. "Do they know?" I asked. "Do they know you found me?" "They know we have a lead," Detective Morrison said carefully. "But we wanted to confirm everything before raising their hopes too high. There have been false leads before." I looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of all our guests, who were standing frozen in shock. These people had come to celebrate my engagement, to toast my future happiness. Instead, they were witnessing the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about myself. Catherine Brennan was standing near the bar, with her hand pressed to her throat, looking like she had seen a ghost. William was beside her, his lawyer instincts clearly warring with his social conditioning, as he tried to process what this meant for his son's engagement to a woman who apparently didn't exist. "I need to sit down," I said suddenly, my legs feeling weak and unreliable. Marcus immediately guided me to a chair, his protective instincts overriding his own shock and confusion. "This is insane," he muttered. "There has to be some mistake," but even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. He was looking at me differently now, as if I were a stranger he was meeting for the first time, and in a way, I suppose I was. Detective Morrison closed his notebook and looked at me with genuine kindness. "I know this is overwhelming, Elena. No one expects you to process all of this immediately. But there are some decisions that need to be made fairly quickly." "What kind of decisions?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The Vasquez family would like to see you, to confirm that you're their daughter. They're prepared to come to Chicago, or we could arrange for you to visit Los Angeles. There's also the question of whether you want to pursue charges against the Mitchells for kidnapping and fraud." The words hit the room like a bomb. Charges. Against the people who had raised me, loved me, given me every advantage in life. The idea was both absurd and somehow inevitable. I looked at Mom and Dad, really looked at them, trying to see past 26 years of conditioning to the truth underneath. They were strangers now, people who had built their entire relationship with me on a crime. But they were also the people who had bandaged my scraped knees and cheered at my school plays and held me when I cried over my first broken heart. "I can't," I whispered. "I can't make any decisions right now. This is too much." Detective Morrison nodded understandingly. "Take the time you need. But Elena, you should know that this investigation is going to move forward, with or without your cooperation. There are other victims, other families that this network destroyed. Your case might be the key to bringing them justice." Other victims. The phrase echoed in my mind, expanding the horror beyond just my own situation. How many other children had been taken? How many other families had been torn apart to satisfy the desperate desires of people like my parents? "I think we should end this conversation for tonight," Marcus said firmly, his protective instincts finally overriding his shock. "Sarah needs time to process all of this before making any major decisions." But Detective Morrison shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Based on what Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell have admitted here tonight, I have probable cause to arrest them on charges of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. They need to come with me now. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Several guests gasped audibly, while others began whispering frantically to each other. This had gone from a family revelation to a criminal arrest, and the reality of what was happening finally began to sink in. "No," I said, standing up suddenly. "You can't arrest them, not here, not like this." Detective Morrison looked at me sympathetically. "I understand your feelings, Elena, but they've confessed to serious crimes. I don't have a choice." Dad stepped forward, his shoulders squared with a dignity I had never seen before. "It's okay, Sarah, we knew this day would come eventually. We've been living on borrowed time for 23 years. "Robert, don't," Mom pleaded, but he shook his head. "No, Linda, it's time to face the consequences of what we did. We gave Sarah a good life, but that doesn't erase the pain we caused her real family." As Detective Morrison began reading them their rights, I felt something inside me break. These weren't just abstract criminals being arrested for nameless crimes. These were my parents, the people who had shaped me into who I was, and watching them being handcuffed in front of a room full of our friends and family was more than I could bear. "Can I talk to them?" I asked, desperately. "Before you take them away, can I just have a minute?" Detective Morrison looked around the room, clearly weighing the optics of the situation against proper procedure. Finally he nodded. 2 minutes. I walked over to where Mom and Dad stood with their hands cuffed behind their backs, and for a moment we just looked at each other. There was so much I wanted to say, so many questions I needed answered, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We wanted to tell you so many times, but we were scared of losing you." "You are our daughter," Dad said fiercely. "Biology doesn't change the fact that we love you more than life itself. Nothing that happens from here on out will ever change that." I reached out to hug them, but Detective Morrison gently stopped me. "I'm sorry, Elena, no physical contact." The use of that unfamiliar name was like a slap in the face, reminding me that even my identity was now in question. Was I Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had spent 26 years building a life in Chicago? Or was I Elena Vasquez, a kidnapped child who belonged to a family I couldn't even remember? As Detective Morrison led my parents toward the exit, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. This was the moment when my old life officially ended, and whatever came next would begin. But I had no idea what that future would look like, or who I would be in it. Marcus put his arms around me as I watched the people who had raised me disappear through the ballroom doors, possibly forever. "We'll figure this out," he whispered into my hair. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." But even as he said the words, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. How could we plan a future together when I didn't even know who I was? How could he marry someone whose entire identity had been built on a lie? The string quartet had finally stopped playing, and the silence in the room was deafening. Slowly guests began to move again, gathering their belongings and making awkward excuses as they headed for the exits. This was supposed to have been a celebration, but it had turned into a crime scene, and no one seemed to know how to process what they had witnessed. Catherine Brennan approached me cautiously, her social training warring with her obvious shock and confusion. "Sarah, dear," she said softly, "perhaps you should come stay with us tonight. You shouldn't be alone right now." But the offer, kind as it was, felt wrong somehow. These people had welcomed Sarah Mitchell into their family, but did that acceptance extend to Elena Vasquez? Would they want their son to marry a woman whose very existence was criminal evidence? "Thank you," I said politely, "but I think I need some time alone to process all of this." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have warned him off. "I'll drive you home," he said instead, but as we made our way toward the exit, I realized that even the concept of home had been stripped away from me. The house I had grown up in, the one filled with family photos and childhood memories, belonged to Sarah Mitchell.
But Sarah Mitchell was apparently a fiction, a character created to hide a stolen child. So where did that leave Elena Vasquez? And how was I supposed to figure out who she was when she had been buried so deep that even I didn't know she existed? The silence in my apartment was deafening. After the chaos of the ballroom, the familiar walls of my living room felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once.
I sat on my couch, still wearing my champagne-colored engagement dress, staring at the framed photographs scattered across my coffee table. Every image told the story of Sarah Mitchell's life. Birthday parties with elaborate cakes, family vacations to the Wisconsin Dells, graduation ceremonies where my parents beamed with pride. But now I knew these weren't just family memories. They were evidence of an elaborate deception that had lasted over 2 decades. Marcus had wanted to stay, but I had insisted on being alone. I needed space to breathe, to think, to try to process the impossible reality that had been thrust upon me. He had reluctantly agreed, but not before making me promise to call if I needed anything. The concern in his green eyes had been genuine, but I had also seen something else lurking beneath the surface. Uncertainty, fear. The man he had proposed to 6 months ago was apparently not the person he thought she was. I picked up a photograph from my high school graduation, studying the faces of the 3 people I had called family for my entire conscious life. Mom's smile was radiant as she stood beside me in my cap and gown. Dad's arm wrapped proudly around both of us. They looked like any normal family celebrating a milestone moment. There was no hint of the dark secret they had been carrying, no shadow of guilt or fear marring their joy. How had they done it? How had they looked me in the eye every single day, knowing what they had done, and managed to live with themselves? More importantly, how had they managed to love me so completely while simultaneously destroying another family's life? My phone buzzed with what felt like the 100th text message since leaving the venue. Friends and family members who had witnessed the scene were reaching out with everything from shocked disbelief to awkward offers of support. I scrolled through them with growing numbness, each message a reminder of how my private world had exploded in the most public way possible. Emma, my college roommate, had sent a long message filled with question marks and concerned emojis. Mrs. Chen from next door had texted to say she was praying for me. Even my old high school math teacher had somehow gotten my number and sent a note expressing his confusion and support. But it was the message from Detective Morrison that made my hands shake as I read it. He had provided contact information for a victim services counselor and the number for a hotel where my biological parents, Miguel and Rosa Vasquez, were staying. They had flown in from Los Angeles that afternoon, hoping against hope that their decades-long search was finally over. I set the phone aside without responding to any of the messages. What could I possibly say? Thank you for your concern, but it turns out my entire existence is a crime. Sorry for the awkward dinner party entertainment, but I just discovered I'm not who I thought I was. The apartment felt smaller with each passing hour, as if the walls were slowly closing in around me. Every familiar object seemed to mock my ignorance. The diploma hanging on my wall bore the name Sarah Mitchell. My driver's license, credit cards, passport, all proclaimed an identity that apparently belonged to no one. I found myself walking to my bedroom, drawn by some masochistic need to examine the evidence of my fictional life. My jewelry box sat on the dresser, filled with pieces that marked significant moments. The pearl necklace Mom had given me for my 16th birthday. The class ring from Northwestern University. The promise ring Marcus had given me before he proposed, a simple band that meant more to me than any expensive diamond. But as I opened the box, something caught my eye that I had never noticed before. Hidden beneath the velvet lining, there was a small bulge. My fingers found a loose corner of fabric, and when I lifted it, a tiny plastic bag fell into my palm. Inside was a child's bracelet, the kind made with colorful plastic beads and elastic string. Most of the beads were faded, but I could still make out letters that spelled a name. Elena. The room spun around me as I stared at this piece of physical evidence from a life I couldn't remember. Elena. My real name, the identity that had been buried so deep I had forgotten it existed. This bracelet was proof that I had once been someone else, someone who had made this simple craft project with the careful concentration that only a 3-year-old could muster. How long had Mom kept this hidden? Had she been planning to throw it away and lost her nerve? Or had she deliberately saved it, perhaps as some twisted form of insurance or reminder of what they had done? I sank onto my bed, clutching the bracelet and trying to will myself to remember something, anything, about my life before the Mitchells. But there was nothing, no flash of recognition, no buried memory fighting its way to the surface. Elena Vasquez was a complete stranger to me, and yet she was supposedly who I really was. My laptop was sitting on my nightstand, and almost without thinking, I opened it and began searching for information about my disappearance. The internet had been in its infancy in 2001, but there were still records to be found if you knew where to look. The first article I found was from the Los Angeles Times, dated March 20, 2001. The headline read, "3-year-old girl vanishes from East LA home." There was a grainy photograph of a little girl with dark curls and serious brown eyes, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. It was me, or rather it was Elena. The resemblance was unmistakable, despite the 23 years that separated that photograph from my current reflection. We had the same stubborn chin, the same slightly crooked smile that I had always attributed to Dad's genetics. The article was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Elena Vasquez had disappeared from her backyard while playing with toys. Her mother had gone inside to answer the phone, and when she returned less than 5 minutes later, her daughter was gone. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no ransom demands. I continued reading, finding follow-up articles that chronicled the investigation's progress. Search parties had combed through every inch of the neighborhood. The FBI had been called in. Volunteer organizations had distributed flyers with Elena's photograph to every corner of the country. But after the first few months, the coverage had dwindled. Elena Vasquez had become another statistic, another missing child whose case went cold while her family was left to wonder what had happened to their little girl. I found more recent articles, pieces from the anniversary of my disappearance, where reporters had checked in with my biological parents. They had never given up hope. Miguel Vasquez had learned to use social media, posting Elena's picture on every platform he could find. Rosa had become involved with organizations that helped other families of missing children, channeling her pain into helping others navigate the same nightmare. There were quotes from both of them that made me cry. "We know she's out there somewhere," Rosa had told a reporter on the 20th anniversary of my disappearance. "A mother knows these things. Elena is alive, and someday she's coming home to us." The guilt was overwhelming. While I had been living a privileged life in Chicago, attending private schools and taking family vacations, my real parents had been trapped in a purgatory of not knowing. They had missed everything. My first day of school, my graduation from college, my engagement to Marcus. All the milestones that the Mitchells had celebrated as if they had every right to be there. I found a Facebook page that Miguel had created called Bring Elena Home. It was filled with age progression photos, showing what I might look like at various stages of my life. The resemblance to my actual appearance was startling. Whatever software they had used to create these images had been remarkably accurate. But it was the comments section that broke my heart completely. Friends and family members had left messages for Elena, talking to her as if she might somehow see them. "Happy birthday, Mia. You would be 26 today. We love you. Elena, if you're reading this, please know that we never stopped looking for you. Come home, baby girl. Your room is still waiting." I closed the laptop, unable to read anymore. The weight of what had been stolen from all of us was crushing. Not just the years of my life that had been built on a lie, but the years that the Vasquez family had lost, the relationship we should have had, the person I might have become if I had grown up knowing my true identity. My phone rang, startling me out of my spiral of guilt and confusion. It was Marcus, and I almost didn't answer. What could I possibly say to him? How could we move forward when I didn't even know who I was? "Sarah." His voice was strained with worry and exhaustion. "I know you said you needed space, but I can't stop thinking about you. How are you holding up?" The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. How was I holding up? I had discovered that my entire life was a lie. My parents were criminals, and somewhere in Los Angeles there was a family that had been waiting 23 years for me to come home. How exactly was someone supposed to hold up under those circumstances? "I found something," I said, instead of answering his question directly. "A bracelet with Elena's name on it. Mom must have kept it all these years." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Sarah, that's evidence, isn't it? You should probably give it to that detective. I know, but the thought of handing over this small piece of my forgotten past felt like another loss. Marcus, what does this mean for us? For our future? Another pause, longer this time. I don't know, he admitted. I love you, but I'm not even sure who you are anymore. Does that make me a terrible person? His honesty was painful but appreciated. No, it makes you human. I don't know who I am either. The legal implications alone are staggering, he continued, his lawyer brain clearly working through the complications. If you're Elena Vasquez, then Sarah Mitchell doesn't legally exist. Your social security number, your birth certificate, everything is fraudulent. We'd have to start completely over with your documentation. I hadn't even thought about the practical aspects of this nightmare. How do you rebuild a legal identity from scratch? How do you explain to employers, banks, credit card companies, that the person they've been dealing with is actually someone else entirely? And then there's the question of inheritance. Marcus continued. If the Mitchells go to prison, what happens to their assets? Do you inherit as Sarah, or does everything get tied up in legal proceedings? And what about the Vasquez family? Do they have any legal claim on you as an adult? The questions were making my head spin. I had gone from being a simple graphic designer, with a straightforward life, to being at the center of a legal and emotional maze that seemed to have no clear exit. I can't think about all of that right now, I said. I need to figure out who I am before I worry about the legal ramifications. Of course, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overwhelm you further. It's just this is going to affect everything, Sarah. Our wedding plans, our future together, even simple things like filing taxes or applying for a mortgage. The practical reality of his words hit me like a physical blow. We had been planning a wedding for next summer, a celebration of our commitment to building a life together. But how could we build anything on a foundation this unstable? Maybe we should postpone the wedding, I said quietly. The words felt like swallowing glass. Maybe we should, Marcus agreed, and his ready acceptance hurt more than I had expected. At least until we figure out what all of this means. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, not bothering to turn on any lights. The familiar shadows felt appropriate somehow, matching the uncertainty that had taken up residence in my chest. A knock at my door made me jump. It was past 10 o'clock, too late for casual visitors. I peered through the peephole and saw Detective Morrison standing in the hallway, looking tired but determined. Miss Mitchell, he said, when I opened the door, I apologize for the late hour, but I wanted to check on you, and there are some developments you should know about. I let him in, noting how his presence made my small apartment feel even smaller. He looked around, taking in the photographs and personal touches that defined Sarah Mitchell's life. How are you processing everything? He asked, his tone gentler than it had been at the party. I found this, I said, showing him the bracelet. It was hidden in my jewelry box. He examined it carefully, pulling out an evidence bag from his jacket pocket. This is significant. It's direct physical evidence, linking you to your original identity.
May I take it for the investigation? I nodded, watching as he sealed the tiny bracelet away. Another piece of my past disappearing into the bureaucratic machinery of justice. You mentioned developments, I said, settling into my armchair while he took the couch. We've made some progress in the larger investigation. The woman who handled your adoption, if we can call it that, was part of a network that operated across multiple states. We've identified at least 12 other cases with similar patterns. The number hit me like a slap. 12 other families destroyed. 12 other children stolen from their real parents and sold to desperate couples who asked no questions. Are any of the other victims still alive? I asked. We're not sure yet. That's one of the reasons your cooperation is so important. You're the first recovered victim who's old enough to potentially remember details about the process. But I didn't remember anything. My earliest clear memory was of being 4 years old, safely ensconced in the Mitchell household with no awareness that anything was amiss. The trauma of my kidnapping, if I had experienced any, was buried so deep that it might never surface. The Vasquez family, I said hesitantly. Are they really here in Chicago? Detective Morrison nodded. They're staying at the Hampton Inn downtown. They're hoping you'll agree to meet with them, but I want to stress that there's no pressure. This is entirely your decision.
The thought of coming face to face with my biological parents was terrifying. What would we say to each other? How do you bridge a 23-year gap filled with pain and loss? What if we didn't connect? What if the daughter they had been mourning for over 2 decades was nothing like the woman I had become? What are they like? I asked. Detective Morrison's expression softened. They're good people who've been living in hell for 23 years. Miguel works construction, Rosa teaches kindergarten. They had 2 more children after you disappeared, boys who are now teenagers. They've never moved from the house where you were taken, hoping that someday you might try to come home. The image he painted was both beautiful and heartbreaking. A family that had refused to give up hope, that had built their lives around the possibility of my return. How could I live up to that kind of faith? They have questions, of course. Detective Morrison continued. They want to know about your life, whether you were happy, whether the people who took you treated you well, but mostly they just want to see you. To confirm that their daughter is alive and safe. I need time, I said. This is all happening so fast. I understand, but Elena, you should know that this story is going to break in the media soon. We've managed to keep it quiet for now, but with the arrests and the ongoing investigation, it's only a matter of time before reporters get wind of it. You might want to consider meeting with your family before that happens. The thought of my story becoming public made my stomach clench with anxiety. I could already imagine the headlines, the speculation, the invasion of privacy that would follow. My quiet life as a graphic designer was about to become a media circus. How much time do I have? I asked. Maybe a day or 2 at most. After that, this becomes a public story whether you're ready or not. Detective Morrison left his business card and went over the procedures for setting up a meeting with the Vasquez family. There would be counselors present, he assured me, professionals trained to help families navigate these kinds of reunions. Everything would be handled with care and sensitivity. But even with all the professional support in the world, I knew that meeting my biological parents would be one of the most difficult things I had ever done. How do you meet your own mother for the second time? How do you look into the eyes of people whose lives you've unknowingly dominated for over 2 decades? After Detective Morrison left, I found myself back at my laptop, searching for more information about my biological family. I found Rosa's teaching credentials, Miguel's business license, even social media profiles for my younger brothers David and Carlos. David was 21, a college student studying engineering. Carlos was 19 and worked at an auto repair shop while attending community college. They both had Elena's eyes, the same dark brown that stared back at me from the mirror every morning. Their Facebook pages were filled with normal young adult activities. David had recently posted photos from a camping trip with friends. Carlos had shared a video of himself working on a motorcycle engine. But scattered throughout their timelines were posts about their missing sister Elena. Missing sister who was me. Happy birthday to my sister Elena, wherever you are. Carlos had posted on what I now realized was my birthday 3 months ago. We love you and we're still looking for you. The casual way he referred to a sister he had never met, the certainty that I was still out there somewhere, was overwhelming. These young men had grown up with my absence as a constant presence in their lives. I was the ghost sister, the missing piece that had shaped their family's identity. I wondered what stories they had been told about me. Did they remember being told that they had an older sister who had been taken? Had my disappearance made their parents overprotective? Had they grown up in a household shadowed by loss and uncertainty? There were family photos scattered throughout their profiles, and I studied them with the intensity of an anthropologist examining artifacts. Miguel and Rosa looked older than I had expected, worn down by years of grief and uncertainty. But they also looked strong, resilient, like people who had refused to let tragedy destroy them completely. The house in the background of many photos was small but well-maintained, with a carefully tended garden and children's bikes in the driveway. It looked like a home where love lived, despite the shadow of loss that must have hung over everything. I tried to imagine myself in those family photos, to picture what my life might have been like if I had grown up as Elena Vasquez, instead of Sarah Mitchell. Would I have been happier, different? Would I have studied the same subjects in college, chosen the same career path, fallen in love with someone like Marcus? The questions were pointless but impossible to ignore. Every choice I had made, every experience that had shaped me, had been influenced by being raised as Sarah Mitchell in a comfortable middle-class home in Chicago. Elena Vasquez might have been an entirely different person, with different dreams and aspirations and fears. But then I thought about the core of who I was, the things that felt fundamental to my personality. My love of art and design, my tendency toward introversion, my dry sense of humor. Would those traits have been the same regardless of how I was raised? Or were they products of my environment, carefully cultivated by parents who had stolen me from another life? My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. I can't stop thinking about tonight. Do you want me to come over? I can bring ice cream and wine and we can figure this out together. The offer was tempting, but I knew that no amount of ice cream or wine was going to help me figure out who I was. This was something I had to work through alone, at least for now. Thanks, but I need some time to process. I texted back, I'll call you tomorrow. The response came immediately. I love you whatever your name is. That doesn't change. Her words brought tears to my eyes. In a world where everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down, Emma's unconditional friendship felt like an anchor. She had known Sarah Mitchell for 8 years, had been my maid of honor, had helped me pick out my engagement dress. But she was offering to love Elena Vasquez just as completely. I wished I could be as generous with myself. The disconnect between my two identities was jarring, like trying to reconcile two different people who happened to share the same body. Sarah Mitchell felt real to me, filled with memories and experiences and relationships that had shaped who I had become. But Elena Vasquez was supposed to be my true self, the person I had been born to be. How do you choose between two versions of yourself when both feel equally valid and equally foreign? I made myself a cup of tea and settled back onto the couch, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of Sarah Mitchell's life. Tomorrow I would have to make decisions about meeting my biological family, about cooperating with the investigation, about what to do with the rest of my life. But tonight I just wanted to sit with the enormity of what had happened, and try to find some small piece of solid ground in the earthquake that had shaken my world to its foundations. The bracelet with Elena's name was gone now, sealed away as evidence in Detective Morrison's investigation. But I could still feel its weight in my palm, could still see those faded letters that spelled out a name I was only just beginning to claim as my own. Elena, it felt strange on my tongue, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. But maybe with time I could grow into it. Maybe I could find a way to honor both the girl who had been taken and the woman who had survived. The morning would bring impossible choices and painful conversations. But for now, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, holding on to the last few hours of being simply Sarah Mitchell, before I had to figure out how to become Elena Vasquez, without losing everything I had built in between. The morning sun streamed through my bedroom windows, but I had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Today was the day I would meet Miguel and Rosa Vasquez, the people who had given birth to Elena, the daughter they had lost 23 years ago. Detective Morrison had arranged for us to meet at a family services center downtown, neutral territory where trained counselors could help navigate what promised to be an emotionally devastating encounter. I had spent most of the night trying to imagine what I would say to them, how I would explain that their daughter had grown up privileged and loved while they suffered through decades of uncertainty and pain. I chose my outfit carefully, settling on a simple blue dress that Marcus had always said brought out my eyes. These eyes that I now knew came from Miguel, inherited DNA that connected me to strangers who should have been the most important people in my life. Looking in the mirror felt like studying a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The drive downtown took me past familiar landmarks that now felt foreign. The coffee shop where I had spent countless mornings working on design projects, the park where Marcus and I had taken long walks discussing our future, the restaurant where we had celebrated my promotion last year. All these places belonged to Sarah Mitchell's life, but what did they mean to Elena Vasquez? The Family Services Center was a modern building designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional, with warm colors and comfortable furniture arranged in conversation groupings. Detective Morrison met me in the lobby, his expression serious but kind. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, studying my face with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to dealing with traumatic reunions. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," I replied honestly. He led me down a hallway lined with artwork clearly created by children, colorful drawings that spoke of hope and healing. We stopped outside a door marked Conference Room B, and I could hear voices inside, speaking in rapid Spanish. My heart clenched as I realized I was listening to my biological parents discuss meeting the daughter they had lost. "They're nervous too," Detective Morrison said softly. "This is just as overwhelming for them as it is for you." When we entered the room, two people rose from chairs positioned near a large window. The woman was small and compact, with graying black hair pulled back in a neat bun and laugh lines around eyes that were unmistakably similar to my own. The man was taller, with weathered hands that spoke of years of manual labor and a face that managed to be both gentle and strong. Rosa Vasquez took one look at me and began to cry, pressing her hands to her mouth as if to hold back 23 years of accumulated grief. Miguel stood frozen, his eyes drinking in every detail of my appearance as if he were trying to memorize me in case I disappeared again. "Elena," Rosa whispered, the name carrying the weight of decades of longing. "Mi niña, mi bebé." The Spanish words stirred something deep in my memory, a phantom sensation of being small and safe, and loved in a language I had forgotten I ever knew. I found myself taking a step forward, drawn by some primal recognition that transcended conscious thought. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what had happened to all of us. "I'm so sorry for all the years you lost." Rosa shook her head firmly, moving closer until she was standing just inches away. "No, Mia, you have nothing to be sorry for. You were a baby. What happened to you was not your fault." She reached out tentatively, her hand hovering near my face as if asking permission. When I nodded, she touched my cheek with fingers that trembled with emotion. "You look so much like your abuela," she said through her tears. "My mother, she would have been so proud to see the beautiful woman you became." Miguel finally found his voice, speaking in accented English that was careful and precise. "We never stopped believing we would find you. Even when the police said to give up hope, even when people told us you were probably dead, we knew in our hearts that you were alive somewhere." A counselor named Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been sitting quietly in the corner, allowing us this first moment of recognition. Now she gently suggested we all sit down and begin the process of getting reacquainted. "This is going to be emotional for everyone," she said in a calm professional voice. "Take your time and remember that there's no right or wrong way to feel about any of this." The next hour passed in a blur of careful questions and tentative answers. Rosa showed me photographs from my early childhood that the Mitchells had never seen, images of a chubby toddler with serious dark eyes playing in a backyard garden. There was Elena at 2 years old, helping her mother plant tomatoes. Elena at 18 months, taking her first steps toward a father who was cheering her on from across the room. "You were such a happy baby," Rosa said, running her finger across one of the photographs. "Always laughing, always getting into mischief. You loved to sing, even before you could talk properly." I studied the images, searching for some spark of recognition, some buried memory that might surface. But the little girl in the photographs felt like a character in someone else's story, familiar only in the way that childhood photos of strangers sometimes evoke a universal nostalgia. Miguel talked about the day I disappeared, his voice breaking as he described coming home from work to find police cars in his driveway, and his wife hysterical with grief. "The worst part was not knowing," he said. "If something terrible had happened to you, at least we would have known. But not knowing meant we could never stop hoping, never stop searching, never stop wondering if we could have done something different." They told me about my brothers, David and Carlos, who had grown up knowing they had an older sister but had never known what happened to her. "They always saved a Christmas present for you," Rosa said. "Every year we would put a gift under the tree for Elena, in case this was the year you came home." The image of 2 decades worth of unopened Christmas presents broke something inside me. While I had been unwrapping gifts from the Mitchells, celebrating holidays that had been built on a crime, my real family had been leaving space for me at their table.
"What were they told about me?" I asked. "The truth," Miguel said simply, "that their sister had been taken from us, but that we would never stop looking for her. We didn't want them to grow up with lies." The irony was almost unbearable. My biological parents had chosen painful honesty with their sons, while the people who raised me had built my entire existence on deception. Walsh guided the conversation toward practical matters.
helping us navigate the complex emotions and logistics of reconnecting after such a long separation. There would be DNA tests to confirm what we all already knew, legal proceedings as the investigation continued, and the challenge of building relationships with people who were both strangers and family. Elena has a life here in Chicago, she said gently. Friends, a career, a fiancé. This reunion doesn't mean everything has to change overnight. But even as she said it, I knew that everything had already changed. Marcus and I had spoken that morning, and while he had been supportive, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. How could we plan a future when my past was still being excavated? Rosa seemed to sense my internal struggle. We don't want to disrupt your life, she said quietly. We know you have people here who care about you. We just want to be part of your world, if you'll let us. Their generosity was overwhelming. After everything they had suffered, after all the years of not knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead, they were willing to accept whatever relationship I could offer. They weren't demanding that I move to Los Angeles or abandon the life I had built. They just wanted to know me. I want that too, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. But I need time to figure out how to be Elena again. I've been Sarah for so long that I don't know how to be anyone else. Miguel smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely happy. You don't have to choose, he said. You can be both. Sarah is who you became, but Elena is who you were born to be. Maybe there's room in your life for both. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and filling in the gaps that 23 years had created. I learned that Rosa had become a teacher partly because working with children helped her feel connected to the daughter she had lost. Miguel had started a small scholarship fund for missing children, using the money he had saved for my college education to help other families navigate similar tragedies. They showed me recent photos of David and Carlos, young men who shared my smile and my stubborn chin. They can't wait to meet you, Rosa said. David has been practicing English phrases all week, and Carlos bought a new shirt for the occasion. The thought of meeting my brothers filled me with equal parts excitement and terror. What if they resented me for the privileged life I had lived while they grew up in the shadow of my absence? What if we had nothing in common beyond shared DNA? As our time together drew to a close, Detective Morrison returned to discuss the next steps in the legal process. The Mitchells had been released on bail pending their trial, but they were prohibited from contacting me directly. Their lawyer had reached out through official channels, expressing their desire to explain their actions and asking for my forgiveness. You don't have to see them if you don't want to, Detective Morrison assured me. But they've asked if you would read a letter they wrote. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The people I had called mom and dad for 26 years were now criminal defendants, and I needed time to process that reality before I could think about forgiveness. As we prepared to leave, Rosa hugged me tightly, and I was surprised by how natural it felt. We know this is complicated, she whispered in my ear. Take all the time you need. We've waited 23 years, we can wait a little longer. Outside the Family Services Center, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to absorb everything that had happened. Meeting my biological parents had been simultaneously easier and harder than I had expected. Easier because they were genuinely good people who had handled an impossible situation with grace and love. Harder because their pain was so palpable, and I couldn't help feeling responsible for it, even though I knew rationally that I wasn't. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How did it go? I stared at the question, unsure how to answer. How do you summarize meeting the parents you never knew you had? How do you explain the strange sensation of recognizing strangers? It was good, I typed back. They're good people, we're going to take things slow. I'm glad. Do you want to have dinner tonight? We should probably talk about what this means for us. The conversation I had been dreading was finally here. Marcus deserved honesty about how this revelation was affecting our relationship, and I owed it to both of us to be clear about what I could and couldn't promise right now. We met at a quiet restaurant near my apartment, the kind of place where we had shared countless meals during our 3 years together. But tonight felt different, charged with an uncertainty that hadn't existed before. Detective Morrison had walked into our engagement party. Marcus looked tired, and I realized that this upheaval was affecting him almost as much as it was me. His orderly world had been disrupted by my chaotic revelation, and he was struggling to find solid ground just as much as I was. "I've been thinking," he said after we had ordered. "About us, about what all of this means for our future." I braced myself for what was coming, recognizing the careful tone he used when he was about to deliver difficult news. "I love you," he continued. "But I'm not sure I know who you are anymore." Does that make sense? It made perfect sense, because I wasn't sure I knew who I was either. "Are you breaking up with me?" I asked quietly. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't want to, but I also don't know how to move forward when everything about our relationship was based on information that turns out to be false." We talked for hours, working through the practical and emotional implications of my situation. Marcus was concerned about the legal complications, the media attention that was sure to follow, and the impact on his career at the law firm. But underneath those practical concerns was something deeper, a fundamental question about whether the woman he had fallen in love with was real, or just a carefully constructed fiction. "Sarah Mitchell is who I've been for 26 years, I said. "Elena Vasquez is a stranger to me. I can't just flip a switch and become someone else overnight." "But you're going to try, aren't you?" he asked. "You're going to explore that part of yourself, build relationships with your biological family." I nodded. "I have to. I owe it to them, and I owe it to myself." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at his untouched dinner. "I think we need to take a break," he said finally. "Not because I don't love you, but because you need space to figure out who you are without having to worry about how it affects us." The words hurt, but I knew he was right. How could I commit to building a life with someone when I wasn't even sure who I was? How could I promise him a future when my past was still being rewritten? We agreed to postpone the wedding indefinitely and take some time apart while I worked through my identity crisis. It felt like another death, another loss in a week that had been full of them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of DNA tests, legal meetings, and carefully orchestrated visits with my biological family. The media had indeed picked up the story, and I found myself at the center of a news cycle that seemed hungry for every detail of my ordeal. "Kidnapped at 3, found at 26, became the headline that followed me everywhere. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, and I had to hire a lawyer to help me navigate the publicity and protect what remained of my privacy. The Vasquez family was dealing with their own media circus in Los Angeles, but they handled it with the same grace they had shown in everything else. Rosa gave one carefully worded interview where she thanked everyone who had helped in the search for Elena, and asked for privacy as our family worked to rebuild our relationships. David and Carlos had flown to Chicago for a weekend visit, and meeting them had been surprisingly easy. Despite the 20-year age gap, we had clicked immediately. David had inherited Miguel's gentle strength, while Carlos had Rosa's quick wit and infectious laugh. They treated me like the sister they had always known I was, with no awkwardness or resentment about the years we had lost. "We always knew you were out there," Carlos told me over dinner at my apartment. "Mom and Dad never let us give up hope." They shared stories about growing up as Elena's brothers, about the way my absence had shaped their family's dynamics. They had both become fiercely protective of their parents, understanding from an early age that their mother and father carried a grief that could never be fully healed. "But now it can be," David said simply. "You're home now." The word home stopped me short. Where was home for Elena Vasquez? Was it the house in Los Angeles where I had taken my first steps, or the apartment in Chicago where I had built my adult life? Could it be both, or neither? I had started seeing Dr. Walsh regularly, working through the complex emotions of my situation with someone trained to help trauma survivors. She helped me understand that there was no right way to handle what had happened to me, no prescribed timeline for processing the revelation that my entire identity had been built on a crime. "Grief is a process," she told me during one of our sessions, "and you're grieving the loss of the life you thought you had, even as you're celebrating the discovery of the family you never knew you had lost." The Mitchells had written me several letters, which I had finally worked up the courage to read. They were full of remorse and explanation, detailed accounts of how they had convinced themselves that what they were doing was somehow justified. They had been desperate for a child, and when the opportunity arose to adopt a little girl who supposedly needed a home, they had let their desperation override their moral judgment. "We know there's no excuse for what we did. Mom had written in her careful script, "But we want you to know that every day with you was a gift, and we tried our best to give you the love and opportunities that you deserved." Their words were painful to read, because I knew they were sincere. The people who had raised me had genuinely loved me, even as they built that love on a foundation of lies. They had given me advantages and opportunities that I might not have had growing up in East Los Angeles. But they had also stolen my connection to my biological family and my cultural heritage. The question of forgiveness was complex and ongoing. I understood intellectually that what they had done was wrong, but I couldn't erase 26 years of love and care. They had been my parents in every way that mattered, except for the most fundamental way of all. The trial was still months away, but already the legal proceedings were taking an emotional toll on everyone involved. The Vasquez family had to relive the trauma of my disappearance, while the Mitchells faced the destruction of everything they had built over the past 2 decades. I found myself caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to the people who had raised me and solidarity with the family, who had never stopped searching for me. It was an impossible position that no amount of counseling or legal advice could fully resolve. 3 months after that devastating engagement party, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to spend the summer in Los Angeles, staying with the Vasquez family, and trying to reconnect with the cultural roots that had been stolen from me. Rosa cried when I called to tell her about my plan. "You don't have to do this for us," she said through her tears. "We don't want you to feel obligated." But it wasn't about obligation. It was about trying to understand who Elena Vasquez might have been, and whether there was a way to integrate her into the person Sarah Mitchell had become. The house in East Los Angeles was smaller than I had expected, but it felt warm and lived in a way that my sterile apartment never had. My childhood bedroom had indeed been preserved exactly as it was, with stuffed animals and picture books waiting for a little girl who had never come home. Living with the Vasquez family was an adjustment, but it was also a revelation. I learned to cook traditional Mexican dishes with Rosa, picked up construction skills helping Miguel with weekend projects, and slowly began to remember fragments of Spanish that had been buried in my subconscious for over 2 decades. David and Carlos welcomed me into their lives with the easy acceptance of siblings, and I found myself forming genuine relationships with these young men who shared my DNA. We had inside jokes and comfortable silences, the kind of natural bond that can't be forced or fabricated. But it was the quiet moments with Miguel and Rosa that affected me most profoundly. Watching Rosa grade papers at the kitchen table, seeing Miguel's gentle patience as he helped neighborhood kids fix their bicycles, I began to understand what kind of person Elena Vasquez might have become if she had grown up in this house. I also began to understand the depth of what had been stolen from all of us. Not just the years we had lost, but the person I might have been, the family traditions I should have inherited, the sense of belonging that comes from growing up knowing where you come from. By the end of the summer, I had made another decision that surprised everyone. I decided to legally change my name to Elena Sarah Vasquez Mitchell, honoring both my biological family and the people who had raised me. It felt like a way to integrate the 2 halves of my identity rather than choosing between them. Marcus and I had stayed in touch throughout my time in Los Angeles, and he had eventually come to visit. Meeting my biological family had helped him understand that my identity crisis wasn't about rejecting who I had been, but about expanding who I could become. "You're still you," he told me, as we walked through the neighborhood where I had taken my first steps. "You're just more complete now." We decided to give our relationship another try, but slowly and without the pressure of immediate wedding plans. There was too much healing still to be done, too many adjustments still to be made. The trial of the Mitchells was scheduled for the following spring, and I had decided to testify on their behalf. Not because I condoned what they had done, but because I wanted the court to understand the complexity of our situation. They had committed a crime, but they had also raised me with love and given me opportunities that had shaped me into the person I had become. The media attention had finally died down, and I was able to return to my work as a graphic designer. But now I was working on a special project, designing materials for organizations that helped families of missing children. It felt like a way to honor what my biological family had endured while using the skills I had developed as Sarah Mitchell. I had also started learning Spanish formally, working with a tutor to reclaim the language that should have been my birthright. It was slow going, but every word I relearned felt like a small victory over the circumstances that had tried to erase Elena Vasquez from existence. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt terrifying. I had two families who loved me, a career that fulfilled me, and a growing sense of who I was that incorporated both Elena and Sarah. It wasn't the life I had planned 6 months ago, but it was mine, and it was real. Standing in my childhood bedroom in Los Angeles, surrounded by toys that had waited 23 years for their owner to return, I finally understood what Detective Morrison had meant when he said I could be both people. Elena Vasquez was who I was born to be, but Sarah Mitchell was who I had become. Together they made me whole. The bracelet with my name had been returned to me after the investigation concluded, and I wore it now alongside the promise ring Marcus had given me years ago. They were symbols of different parts of my journey, but they no longer felt contradictory. They were just pieces of a story that was finally making sense. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.